good morning. My name is Toby. That's Mickey. We're going to talk to you about UART. Quick show of hands. How many of you are here because there was no space in Jeff Forrestal's talk about Android? How many of you are lying? Okay. How many of you have any experience with UART or JTAG debugging in systems? Excellent. Okay. So this is intended to be a general overview and introduction to UART. If there's stuff that is repetitious for you, our apologies. And if there's something new or there's something else you'd like us to talk about, let us know. First, most important legal disclaimer, this has nothing to do with our employers. This is in no way their work, their opinions. This is all our own stuff. We take full responsibility for everything and anything said here. Anything good is our brilliance and everything bad is our fault. Mickey, you want to repeat that?
No.
All right.
You said it well. Who am I? My name is Mickey. What I do for a living is break hardware and firmware. That's it, basically. A little bit of a history. Last year we did a talk about the Windows sidebar gadgets. And that's it.
He used to be a web developer, and then he moved to the dark side and got involved in real security.
I'm also bad at describing myself.
My name is Toby. I do enterprise security. I break applications, not hardware, and unfortunately then I have to fix them as well. I've been doing it a while, I guess. So today we're going to run through a bunch of different areas. We're going to give you some background on what UART is. We're going to talk about what you can do with it, all the sorts of stuff that it's fun for. We're going to talk a little bit about embedded systems and why this is interesting. We're going to give you some examples of tools, and we're going to talk about how you would get involved in UART and why it's fun and easy to play with. And then we're going to give you some examples of places where we've succeeded and other places where we haven't found anything interesting. And finally, we're going to talk about if you're developing embedded systems, how you can do a better job than some of these companies have of protecting their systems from explorers. So, general intro. This is really just about sharing our experience. This is not going to be full of 0 days and exciting new attacks. UART has been around for a really long time. So there are people who have explored this, but this is something where when we looked, it was novel to us, and it was something that we saw not many people talking about. Lots of people talk about JTAG, lots of people talk about other sorts of reversing. We're seeing people talking about stripping chips these days, but we hadn't seen this discussed. So what we're looking here to do is to give you a little more about how to use it and how to explore with it and how you would go about doing so. UART background. So technically, UART stands for Universal Asynchronous Receiver Transmitter. What is it? We're not really sure. We think it came from heaven, or maybe it's gnomes. There are pretty good sources. Actually, obviously we do. It's been around for a long time. A very long time. There are references to it in the old AT&T systems. There are references to seeing it being developed by Gordon Bell for PDP systems. Show of hands, who knows what a PDP is? Cool. Okay. So it's been around for a long time. It's a fairly fundamental concept that gets built out in a number of different ways. The thing that matters about it really, rather than where it came from or who first designed it, is what it's used for and what goes through it. You get data through it. Lots of data, all sorts of interesting data. Sometimes you even get raw data, unformatted, straight, no control, anything going through it. It gets very interesting. The other piece is how embedded systems actually use it. And the reason that's interesting is that it's frequently used as a console output. So on a device that has no KVM, that has no expectation of having a display, of having any sort of input mechanism, they use this as a way to actually get access to the console, or at least one of the TTYs, one of the terminals that they can use to specifically do debugging or updating or modification of the system when it's running. What's it for? Well, officially, it does some fairly basic things. It just translates from parallel to serial formats. You can see it evenly? Okay, good. In practice, what you really end up with is a interconnect that's feeding between different parts of the system, which means that you can use this, sure, as a console, And we'll talk about that and you'll see that, and that's probably going to be the more interesting place. But you can also use it when you connect to it to see information passing between different components on the PCB. You can actually get different data streams coming back and forth, which means that if you need to debug something fairly subtle between your storage and your RAM or your CPU and your storage, you can actually start doing that here. You can see interesting things moving back and forth. The big one, though, like I said, is that it's going to be a debug console. And it's going to be used by most embedded systems for that purpose. Why not use JTAG? Well, JTAG is cool, but it's more expensive in terms of the hardware. It also takes a much heavier lift in terms of building your skill set. Frankly, you can give UART to anyone who's got a systems background. If they've got an interface, you're going to give them a Unix console. And as long as they can play with that, they're going to be good. In contrast, if you're using JTAG, you're going to be doing kernel debugging, you're going to be dealing with memory dumps, and you're going to need to be able to read assembly and understand what's going on in the internals of the system. It's a heavier lift. They're both useful, but they're useful for different sorts of things.
So we talked about UART, so how do we recognize it physically with our own eyes? This is what it looks like. 4 pins, usually. Most cases are 4 pins sticking out of the PCB. Sometimes they're not. There's no header soldered. It's just 4 pins in holes in a row. Sometimes it's tagged. Makes it easy. Simple. All you need for UART are 4 pins, 1 for voltage, 1 for ground for reference, and 1 for receive and 1 for transmit. It's a full duplex system. Okay, so an interesting way to verify that you are using UART that you are finding UART is to poke at every pin and pad on the PCB.
For what it's worth, actually, most of the time when we looked, you'll just see that row of 4 pins. In the majority of the cases, we saw the row of 4 pins. It's really common, but there were some where I'd look at it and I didn't see anything, and Mickey would grab it and say, oh, yeah, let's try that. And so we wanted to bring out exactly how you do that.
So this is the flow, and the rough flow of how you do it. You find interesting pins or pads in any configuration on the PCB. Could be 4 vias in a matrix, for instance, or a row of pins, a row of holes. It has nothing to do with anything you see on the board, or you follow lines coming from the CPU onto some pins. Once you map those out, you need to find ground, which is easy. We'll talk about that later. Now this is written in blood, so just to make sure that you don't fry your tools. Sometimes lines are 5 volts and your tool is 3 volts, and that they don't really like each other. You then connect the ground to your device. You boot the embedded system, the tool. You boot the embedded system. While it's booting, if UART is used on the embedded system, it will transmit. So the easiest way would be to just take the receive line of your tool and just poke at all the pins until you see something. If it's gibberish on the screen, could be it's just raw data, or you're in a different baud rate, different speed. You need to adjust your tool. If it's not garbage, if you see English, you win.
And we'll talk about the actual individual tools for each of these steps. We'll go into Bus Pirate. We'll talk about how you check for voltage, everything else in just a little bit. So embedded systems at a fundamental level, they're really very simple things. And to make an embedded system, you just need 3 basic components. You need some RAM, you need a little bit of storage, and you need a CPU. These are some simple examples of different components that you might find, but there are literally thousands of vendors and tens or hundreds of thousands of components that you could combine in any or in any combination to give you what you need to be an embedded system. They're really very simple, and as a result, they're being put everywhere. This is the cliche of, I hate to say it because I'm going to have to pay for it later, Internet of Things. But this is where you're getting the fact that you're putting logic into everything. Generally, what you're going to see as a result of this, because they're being used everywhere is that there's actually fairly consistent layouts that you see for different PCBs. And it makes it much easier to start recognizing things. That's why when we started looking at different boards and looking for UART, the majority of them, it was actually pretty easy to find the actual UART pinouts. Even when things were fairly different, it would be pretty predictable. I mean, the reason we had quotes around interesting is, how do you know what interesting is? Well, as it turns out, you look at a couple of these and you start noticing, oh, that looks like those are the right 4 pins. Those look like an interesting combination of tag points. I should poke at something there. Interesting actually becomes pretty clear because the layouts are fairly standard.
Now, just to be clear, this is not, I don't consider this hardware hacking. This is the low-tech way of finding interesting stuff. You don't need to be a hardware hacker to do this. All you need is a couple of basic tools and very basic knowledge.
You want to mention, go back. Before we move on, operating systems. You may run into some RTOS real-time operating systems. There are a couple different vendors out there, but more and more what you're likely to see is going to be either BSD or Linux. And really almost, I don't know, what, 80% of the time, 90% of the time, it's probably going to be Linux. It's not going to be Linux like you're used to if you run it as a desktop or for a server. It's going to be stripped down to the point where most of your favorite tools are missing. And then sometimes some really odd things are in there. So we've seen cases where Snort is in there even though it's not necessary, or GDB compilers will show up sometimes, but it's not consistently there.
All the debug tools, TCP dump, Telnet, Netcat, it's still there. It's just not used.
At the same time, useful stuff like VI may not be there. You may literally be doing catting of text or echoing of text into a file in some cases.
So we have seen one with VI in it,
yeah,
which was very useful.
It was really handy, but it was an anomaly. Most of the time we didn't see one with decent editors. I don't think we ever had to resort to ed, but it was simplistic in many cases. Most tools will be missing, at least at the system level, and you'll have a very limited file system in general. So everyone thinks about routers. When we talked about this and when people have asked what we're talking about, everyone says, oh, okay, so routers, right? Well, sure, routers are the obvious ones, but there's so much more. The pile of stuff that we have sitting here are some of the examples. We did this on our own budget. We did this on our own dime, so we couldn't get some of the bigger and more interesting devices, but you're going to see this in, well, for instance, you'll see this in enterprise-class routers, enterprise-class firewalls, anything with embedded hardware systems, you're going to see UART in. Anything that doesn't expect to have a head, you'll see UART in. You're going to see this in things like home power control systems. X10, this is a Wemo. You'll see it in HDTV streamers, so your Hulu or your Roku box will have it. All these sorts of things are likely to have UART. We didn't take apart our refrigerators, both because, well, we've got fairly old refrigerators, but also because we didn't want to have to replace our refrigerators. But you're likely to see it. If something's got embedded logic, it's very likely to have UART in it. I found myself on a treadmill one day looking and thinking, I bet this thing has UART in there. I bet it does. And certainly if I actually would. I'd be willing to bet the money that there's actually a UART interface. You're going to find this almost everywhere.
Including phones.
Yeah.
How about the tools? Okay, so the most easy way to start finding UART would be using the FCC database. It's open on the internet. You can just look up an FCC ID and you find interesting stuff. So to make things interesting, you need to connect to the network, and we'll do a live example. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask. No. Go away.
In
Yeah.
Between multiple UARTs?
Yeah, that's the question.
So the question was, sometimes in devices you'll see multiple UART interfaces available, and there's going to be some logic that's used and some code that's used to control which one is going to be sent or received data from at different points in the platform. As far as I know, when we've seen that, it's been in the kernel for the system as it starts booting. Mickey?
I'm trying to present my screen, but my computer doesn't like me.
But yeah, I generally be looking at the system configuration for which device it's actually configured to read out to and read in from. But I haven't seen many of those. I'd be interested afterwards, come up, and it'd be neat to know which ones you're seeing it in. All right. It's intentional, of course. Unfortunately, we didn't make sufficient sacrifices this morning to the demo gods, so we are playing with fire a little bit. But no,
it was just the Mac decided to go on strike.
Okay, why don't we go back to slides? So you'll have to trust us, or you could, on your own device right now, pull up the FCCID database, and we can give you an example of what an FCCID looks like. You can find them on the bottom of a device. So you'll see something under the list of certification stamps. You'll see literally something that says FCCID. In this one, it's PY309400124. As an example, it's always going to be there on anything that's a legitimate device. You're going to have an FCCID. You just go to the database and search for it, and you're golden. And you'll get back an entire set of data. You'll get data sheets for it. You'll get images of all of the PCBs from a couple different views, as well as having the covers stripped off of components and general information. It becomes really useful. It's a really easy way to go and look for things that are likely to have UART interfaces and to try and figure out where they are.
The next one on the list is a bus pirate. Anyone here does not know what a bus pirate is? Raise your hand.
Somebody.
Okay, so this is a bus pirate. This tiny little red thing. Sorry, I'm sitting down, I'm not used to it. This tiny little red thing is what's commonly called the Swiss Army knife of the hardware hacker. We're using this because it's more convenient to use. It doesn't mean that we can't use anything else. We're going to talk about a different tool. It costs like $8 on eBay. This one is $30. Not a very expensive tool. Gives you a whole lot of things, a whole lot of
macros and control setups. It allows you to interface with a huge number of hardware interfaces. It allows you to control baud rate and reset the device and do a number of other capable things. You could spend many, many hours just talking about the bus pirate. And it's actually something that's been built out of the hacking in the sort of the builder community, the maker community. So it's a nice thing to support the companies that actually make them. They're just really handy things to do and really handy things to have.
Next one on the list is a multimeter.
So when we were talking about how you make sure that your voltage isn't too high for whatever your tools are, this is how you want to do it.
Yeah, and it's an awesome ground finding tool, which you can also do with a battery and an LED. Other tools, like I said, $8 on eBay, USB UART cable. If you can buy it from China, it can be under $1 if you buy it in bulk. Soldering iron, very important if you find the pins on the PCB and you want to connect your bus pirate to it. You need to make it comfortable. Magnifying glass, because we're old and we can't really see very well, and sometimes the pins are really, really small. Some of these embedded systems are tiny. The Wemo, for instance, is half of a credit card, the entire PCB. there are TP-Link devices that are mobile routers that you can plug a 3G hotspot to them and they can act as an access point. Those are really fine-made PCBs. The test points are really small. Can do it without a magnifying glass and a bright light.
So the reason you would want both the USB to UART cable as well as something like the bus pirate, and you really do probably want both as well as the other pieces, the soldering irons and others, is if you have the pins actually set for you, if you actually have pins on the test points, then you can easily just plug into one of the test points and plug it into your USB port with a USB to UART interface, and it's very easy. If it's set up cleanly, you'll just get whatever's coming out of the UART interface. That's really handy to have. At the same time, a lot of the times you're searching for what the pins actually mean and what they're for, and having something like the Bus Pirate, which allows you to very baud, very configuration, the sort of interface that you're working with becomes much more useful so that you can experiment and look around a little bit.
Finally, we have something to show you. Back to the FCC ID. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to go Google FCC ID, first result, an old web page redirects you to the new one. It needs the FCC ID, so let's take the FCC ID off this one. So it's the first 3 characters, and then the rest of it. And we see one entry. There's an entry and an update. And inside this thing, usually what you'll see is internal photos. In the internal photos of the device, it's easier to find compatible devices without buying them. Just find their FCC ID and look in the internals, and you don't have to spend money. So this is a great example. As you can see, let me get this a little bit enlarged. As you can see here, we have 4 pins sticking out. Now, sometimes the FCC ID pictures will not represent reality because these companies submit these photos to the FCC for approval, but it won't be the final PCB most of the times. So the production product might not have those pins sticking out of it. But as you can see, 4 pins can only mean one thing.
Well, it's most likely only going to mean one thing.
Thank you for correcting me there. And as we said, we have the CPU, we have a flash chip, and again, the other side too, this is the Therios. Sometimes they really zoom in, very nice. You can Google the chip and get more data off it. Here. And
so a simple example of how you would use the FCC ID interface. It seems like a really simple and obvious thing, but it really is just tremendously helpful. And it ends up being the default thing you go to on every single case. Yeah. No, it's free. It's completely free. Yeah.
Google is our friend.
Yeah. It is a valuable service provided by the government. Who would have thunk?
Yeah.
Okay. Want to go?
So, the eureka moment is when you plug in the UART and then you get a Linux shell, which is awesome. We all love Linux shells. And most of these just boot the shell and as root.
And no authentication.
No authentication whatsoever.
It's fun to get a shell. It's really fun to get a root shell that didn't require you to log in.
And once you're in the shell, you can just browse it and you see interesting stuff. For instance, you can go into the web directory of your device and see all the files. You don't need to enumerate them. You don't need to brute force them. Just have a list of them. See the permissions. Whatever you want. Some of these are named really funny, like hidden info.
So remember that this is dealing with an embedded device. So this is something where if you didn't have this interface, you'd have no other method of getting to this information. It would be a pure black box experiment. You'd be poking at it, you'd be brute forcing it, you'd be fuzzing it, you'd be asking what other people had seen. All of a sudden with this, you have the doors wide open. Everything's just exposed.
I'm trying to get to why I should care, and not this great presentation, but as someone who works for a hardware manufacturer that may have this issue. So we sell a device to a user. The device has to be able to access, open it up with a screwdriver, solder cables to the.
So why would it matter? So the question is.
So at that point, we've sold them the device. If they want to fuck it up, that's fine.
Right, so the question was, why would this matter if you need physical access to do it? And I swear we didn't, he's not a friend of ours, we don't know him, we didn't set him up to ask that question. So when we give you the answer in like 3 minutes, it wasn't that he got paid to do that. Thank you though. The answer will...
In the next slide,
we'll get there in a second.
We'll show you the answer to that question. Awesome question. So what else can you do? You're looking from the device, from the inside out. You have an insider look at what's going on inside. So if you test your attacks or you want to check something against the device, it's not just a black box anymore. You get to see processes fail if you do something wrong. You get to see crashes from the kernel. You get to get more information.
You get to interact with it like it's a real computer, like it's a real system. And this is some of the wonder and the value kind of gets lost because everyone's used to looking at debug information and seeing this stuff from every computer that you interact with. Instead of thinking about being able to get this from a laptop or a Unix system or whatever else that you're used to that has SSH or has some other interface that is friendly to you and is intended to deliver this information to you, imagine that you plug in, because it's next to me, this to the wall, and you want to know something about what's on it, and you decide that you're going to try and figure out how it works. All you're doing is throwing stuff up against a blank, unresponsive wall until you have something like this as an interface. And so all of a sudden, for the value of being able to explore or research or purely learn about, this takes you back to the point where you have a real system to interact with. So yeah, the stuff that you're seeing here, none of this should be surprising or unusual to anyone who's logged into a system or done debugging of any sort. What you need to recognize is that it's cool because otherwise you'd be guessing at a blank wall. You just not have any sort of information coming back. And it makes it much easier to find things that may actually be useful and interesting.
And to answer your question.
I think I understand. So you essentially, you get into the device, you essentially do a vulnerability assessment against the device, find out the holes, and then once you go out to the internet, fingerprint those devices, you find out what holes are remotely exploitable, and things like boom.
That's one aspect.
That's certainly one way you can do it. Absolutely. Now, I mean, so his answer was, yeah, you use this as a way to do vulnerability research against devices, and then what you've now got is deep, specific knowledge about an entire class of a device. So, for instance, has anyone read the Scanning Internet 2012 report that was published on Pastebin? Did anyone see this? Yeah. So they compromised many embedded devices and replaced their firmware with custom firmware. And they had to find vulnerabilities in all these devices that they could use to do this. Well, the way you do something like that would be to use something like the UART interface. Now, they very likely use JTAG, but that's a guess. But that's exactly what you would use this for, is it gives you that additional information. It also, in some cases, gives you other information, like, for instance, the certificates. Sometimes not just the public certificate, sometimes also the private key as well for signing. You'll see passwords stored in there that are going to be universal across all the systems in the entire space. You can do a number of different things. You can easily use this for giving yourself debug access for UART or for fuzzing. I mean, fuzzing is difficult if you don't have any. Well, fuzzing is difficult, but it's more difficult if you don't have access to the debug information at all. If all of a sudden the device stops responding and you have no clue why, and you don't know whether it was this fuzz test or the previous one or 15 back, it's much easier to do this sort of stuff when you actually have the information.
Yeah. By the way, the Belkin Wemo was fixed. It was responsibly disclosed.
Everything that we're actually going to talk about, to be clear, we did responsible disclosure on. Vendors were engaged, the fixes have been released, firmware updates have been released. It's all up to date and the vendors were good to work with. We'd like to thank them.
Okay.
So, why else would this be interesting? You asked about, you could connect these, you could use this to find vulnerabilities, you could connect to them remotely. Well, the interesting thing is, and this is something that someone I think tremendously highly of and just is really an inspiration, pointed out a couple of years ago in some work that he did. Barnaby Jack did an ATM hack a couple of years ago. Everyone knew it, everyone saw it. One of the things he pointed out, though, is that the key to the vault in the ATM is really hard to get, and it's really hard to crack. However, there's about 4 keys that allow you to access all of the logic systems. And having those 4 keys, you can unlock that, pop it open, plug in a USB stick, close it, turn it back on, reboots, boots from your firmware, game over. So even if you're walking up to a system, having access to this interface, if it's externally exposed or you understand some of the pieces, because in some cases they are, accessible even without cracking the full case. You can do some interesting things.
So forensics on embedded systems. Well, once you make changes through UART, after the system reboots, it all disappears. It's all volatile. The way an embedded system works is it reads its whole operating system from a flash, loads it into RAM, and then boots itself. Every time it boots from the same image. So every change you make after it boots is volatile. So what can we do with it? We were thinking of a fun way to show you guys. Prank your friends, basically. What we did was we took a very cheap router, slapped a battery pack in the back, which made it mobile, and I'll show you a video in a second. And reprogrammed it with this. Can you see this? We'll see it in a video in a second.
You need to plug sound in?
No, there's no sound. So we have the target, $15 router. Again, the battery pack in the back. Default settings is generic SSID, nothing touched. We have the pawn box, 2 Arduinos in it. Specifically designed to scare people.
It's not designed to scare, it's designed to encourage you to push the happy red shiny button.
What we do is just connect this to the router after it boots. The Ethernet cable is used to transfer files to the device. This is the UART interface. Plug in the UART. Power up the device. As you can see, the lights are blinking on the router. It means it's doing something, and we have a new network showing up. It's really blurry, so you're going to see it in a second. Yep.
Yeah, most things will connect automatically to ATT Wi-Fi, and most people will connect automatically to ATT Wi-Fi.
So it's a little bit blurry, but I paste the link for Google and a new network, and I hit go.
Can you all read that? Yeah. So by plugging this into the router was wiped, reflashed. Well, not fully, not reflashed, reconfigured. It wasn't reflashed, which is actually a benefit here. And now becomes something that will automatically compromise anything that connects through it. The beauty is when it's rebooted, as Mickey pointed out.
Wait. It's mobile. No forensics. Once you cut the power, it all resets to normal.
You can go with that little device with the little switch to all of the little Wi-Fi hotspots set up around and set them off and
Yeah, pretty much you could use this. You could do this, and it would take some work, but yeah, you could do something similar. There's a question over there?
Speak up.
Say that again? Oh, the Ethernet jack?
Oh, you mean the Ethernet? The two Arduinos in this box. One is an Ethernet Arduino shield, which we use to serve files. So it acts as a web client, and through UART, we're telling the embedded system to wget or snarf the files from that client, and you can put whatever we want on it. At first, we wanted to put Rickroll, but it was too big for the embedded system.
And I refuse to do that to people. I think it's obscene and cruel. So the beauty is that you just pull the power, and the configuration is gone. It flashes back to where it started. There's no evidence. There's no information, and at some point, someone's going to have to pull the power for one of these things.
Yeah, and if you slap a solar panel on this thing, it can run for a long time.
Unless you live in the Pacific Northwest.
Okay, so I think we're going to save it to the end so we can make as much as we can. I'm going to show you how we connect to a router from our Windows system. So we can do this. It's very easy. It's a $15 router. Super. It's not like $100. What's it called? Pen testing tool.
It's certainly not as powerful as a Pwn plug or something, or a Pineapple, but for some cases you don't need it to be. And at $15, I'm much more willing to throw away a $15 device than I am to throw away a $100 or $200 or $500 device. I'm much more willing to throw a $15 device. So we worked with the WeMo team at Belkin, and they specifically upgraded the firmware to actually just require a login. And at a fundamental level, this is the first step in terms of actually doing this. We don't recommend getting rid of the UART interface. That doesn't make sense. Anyone who's worked with hardware or built hardware understands you need some way to do this work. But there are some simple things you can do that just make it more secure. First one being just simply require a login. Have a user and password. And even if it's generic, even if it changes just with your different versions of the firmware, you've raised the bar just that little bit. You want to go back half a second? The other sorts of things you can do, you can disable logging. This is actually a really important one, because even if you can't log in, even if you've just got a blank screen, if you're dealing with a console output, for anyone who knows a Unix system, you're going to get on the console, you're going to get just the dump of the system logs continuously, or the alerts for the system. Anything that's going as part of the admin logging is going to just dump out there. You can disable it easily enough. It's a simple thing that's worth doing again to prevent it.
A real-life example would be an embedded system that had a USB port. You are, with credentials, can log in. You just see the logging on the system console. But once you plug in a USB storage device, it looks for a specific file in a specific path, and it outputs it to the logging on the screen. So that will allow you to basically fall back to older versions of the firmware, because that's the way it was supposed to be a backup. The only other way to update the firmware on that device would be to go online.
So you can remove the UART interface if it's possible, if you don't need it, if you've got other paths into the device. It's really the most effective choice. But like I said, as people who, if you deal with hardware, it's going to be hard to justify in doing that. This is what we've recommended in general, and this is so easy to do. If this sounded straightforward and pretty obvious to you, we met our goals. We wanted this to sound like something you could pick up in an afternoon, and it really is. It's just that simple. So the question is, why aren't people doing this? Go play. Go on, go play. But don't play. So
yeah, we wanted to make this a little bit fun. So we got this thing, a device we're going to rip out of the box and open right here. We will try and accommodate requests from the audience if you haven't. Once we log
fuzzing
in
or other sorts of stuff. By the way, before we get distracted by doing that, I realized we didn't mention it at the beginning. The first embedded talk I ever saw, and the first thing I ever saw that made me think this sort of stuff was cool, was Barnaby Jack in 2006 talking about debugging and rewriting firmware on a home router. He managed to make the home router download binaries you were interested in ahead of time, inject his backdoor into them, and then recalculate the hash so that the hash displayed on your website was correct for the modified binary. He did it with a JTAG. It was amazing. It's awesome. He totally inspired me, and I think he inspired lots and lots of people. So we just wanted to say that we wouldn't be on this path if it weren't for him.
So I opened the device, trying to connect it to power. I have a bus pirate here connected to my computer. I'll just switch to it in a second.
You want to turn on your camera and see if we can show them
Yeah, in a second.
So we're going to try and turn on the camera and show you what the actual PCB looks like.
That would be easier. Okay. So this is the router on the table here. Very simple. The pins. Any questions, by the way? Nothing?
We're going to keep poking at this stuff. We've got some more time, but don't feel obliged if you're not interested to see this part. You don't have to stay. The slides we'll make available, and that was the majority. This is just an example of how you can do this and how easy it is. So if you've got questions you'd like to ask, feel free to come up. If you are interested to see this, please stay. We're happy to talk. If not, we won't hold you to it, and we won't blame you for leaving.
So all we need is ground, TX, and RX. So first we find ground, like we said we would. If you ever use the multimeter, you know this function.
Could you guys hear that? Yeah? Okay.
Okay. So to find the ground, usually what you do is you look for something like this, a hole in the PCB or an exposed surface, the frame of a wireless controller, like this for instance, this golden strip will be usually connected to ground. Sometimes the ground plane is obvious. This is the antenna. Antennas are also good grounds. So I'm just gonna poke these pins one at a time and touch the ground plane. That's not ground, this is the other way. Okay. So this one would be ground. What I'm going to do is I'm going to connect the bus pirate ground to that one. That's it, we're done. Now starts the fun stuff. We connect to the bus pirate. Set it to a serial. Sorry, let me go back. There are different modes in the bus pirate. I'm going to choose UART number 3. And now I'm going to choose the speed of the bus. Most devices will be 115, 200. So I'm going to use that. I have never encountered a situation where I had to choose parity bits or any other information, so I'm just going to leave it as default. And the output I'm going to use as normal because I have ground connected. So Bus Pirate gives me an opportunity to sniff. It has macros. So if I do a list of macros, I can do a transparent bridge between the Bus Pirate and the device. I can do a live monitor, which I'm going to use now, and a bridge with flow control. It's more technical. I'm going to leave it out now. So I'm going to start with sniffing. And I take the wire from the RX line on the Bus Pirate and to find the TX line on the device. So the device is now powered off. I'm going to power it on and poke at each pin. So pin number 1, nothing. Pin number 2, no. Oh, we got something on pin number 2. I got the system booting up. Awesome.
Wow, that was easy.
Yeah, that was super easy.
For the record, no, we did not plan this. That literally was a device that was just pulled out of a box.
So we saw that we got the TX out of the device. Now we need to find the RX line in so we can write and do commands. So I'm going to put it on a bridge mode. Take the other line, the TX from the Bus Pirate to the RX in the device. So I have 2 pins left. One of them is VCC, the other one is RX. Again, remember, VCC could be bad if you connect the wrong line somewhere. So luckily, I know this device. We're good friends. So I'm going to connect the pin and start typing, and I can see it on the monitor because if I transmit from the Bus Pirate, I should receive it back from the device. So I know the loop is closed. And, oh, I have a shell.
What do you know?
It's super cool.
You now have a file system.
Oh, look, tab completion. Oh, nice.
You have a root prompt there, so you have a sense of what user you probably are.
We got here, we got, net scan, net dump. Interesting stuff. IP tables. Some of these are really interesting because they have LED controls with GPIOs. You can just play with it. It's fun. Let's see. Well, not this one.
Snarf.
Yeah, it has snarf.
So,
no, the fun. Here's an example. You go to the www root, and you can see all the files. Not only that, you can see all the permissions. Some of these are executable. I'm not going to show you which ones, but they're weird. This is a perfect example because this embedded system is even, this embedded system in particular shows you in color. It's very nice. Some of these don't.
but by being able to see everything in the web root, you can see all of the possible screens that you'd be interacting with through the official web interface that the device has. You can see which ones might be available, which ones are going to have more interesting data in them, which ones are going to have more interesting permissions. If you're looking for cross-site scripting vulnerabilities or SQL injection opportunities or command execution opportunities, this makes your tasks so much easier. You've got all of the source. You don't have to blindly scan or use any of your tools, you can just go and look at the source and see everything you might possibly want out of it. Everything that you know how to do against a live system that you're running on, you can now do instead of having to blindly poke at a device. Yeah. Sure.
Sure.
Yeah. Now you won't get stuff like TOP or necessarily LSOF for any other sorts of high-end things, but yeah, PS you'll have, and it's a good point. You're always going to see something interesting. To some level, to some extent, at this point, this becomes an exercise in how do you explore a freshly connected system? How do you explore to a system that you've just compromised or that you've just gained control over so that you can learn about it and do interesting things to it? And exploring the file system, looking for tools, looking for running processes, looking for cron jobs, looking for key files, looking for SSH files, looking for anything like that. Those are all reasonable and appropriate tasks.
Utelnet D, non-volatile RAM. You can take this device, reconfigure it with a script, and resell it as a different one.
So one of the things that we've found really useful is just doing this for pure debugging purposes, being able to watch when we're fuzzing something and watch how it fails and how it crashes, and actually being able to see the logs becomes really useful. We were going to do a demo of the fuzzing, but it ended up taking longer to run through some of the fuzz tests than we really wanted to spend in here.
Yeah, we wanted to show you how we use Peach to fuzz this device and basically make it crash. The problem is it takes about 10 minutes. You can get it any lower than that. It just fills up memory and then it crashes.
Which is worth actually noting. These devices have so little memory that it is very easy to overload them. Another reason why it becomes nice to have this view into them so that you can know when you're pushing them too hard and you can back off potentially and have something smooth. Any other questions? Okay. This has been our presentation. We hope this has been useful to you. We're going to continue poking at this a little bit, but otherwise, you're free to go. Thank you.